What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the fighting game tutorial series, we are going to be going over our practice mode settings part 2. Specifically, we're going to be navigating through the practice settings menu. So when we come into practice mode here, we're in practice mode because we have our hurt boxes showing and all of our practice data. I can press my button that I've assigned. At this point, it's going to pause the game, so you see that the characters aren't moving anymore like they were in the previous episode, and then we're going to be able to navigate this menu. So you can see all the buttons are light blue, and then there's one that's closer to a light gray. That light gray one is the one we're currently selecting. This is going to be super important because the next episode is how we actually change these settings, and some of those are going to be the AI behavior, regenerating health, regenerating super, but we need to be able to navigate this menu to do any of those, to set any of those things up correctly. Now, if you want to get caught up in the series, before you check out this episode, feel free to click on this playlist right here in the top right corner. You can see everything that we've done in the series, from hitboxes, our practice mode, and much more. If you don't care about that entire playlist, you only care about the practice mode settings or just settings in general, I'll link you to this episode right here in the top right corner. This is the previous episode of the practice mode settings, and we're going to be building off that logic today, so it is important that you have that before following the content in this episode. But with that out of the way, we can go ahead and get started. So this is a code and blueprint tutorial series. We're going to be doing everything in the blueprint today because we're mainly going to be dealing with the practice settings widget. There will be a few improvements to the base character as well. So starting off, let's go to our practice settings widget, and for me that is in blueprints, widgets, menus, and it is called practice settings. We also have this practice settings row that we're going to want to open now too. So here's practice settings, and practice settings row is right here. As far as the design goes, these are exactly the same as they were in the previous episode. I haven't changed any of the visuals about practice settings or practice settings row, and practice settings row doesn't have any additional behavior in it, but we want to keep this here because we are going to be modifying the style of this button, and we need to handle a few things with that. Going over to the full practice settings widget, we need to go into the graph and actually add behavior. In the previous episode we had no behavior, and we're just going to add a little bit today. We'll do the bare minimum of what we need. So first things first, we're going to need event construct. So what happens when we open this menu? And you can do so by right clicking and typing event construct. I am going to pause the game while we open this menu. It's not required that you do that. You could have the game running. I had it running in the background. I actually didn't like how that looked. Really, it doesn't matter what you choose to do with that. It is up to you. I'm going to go ahead and set my game to be paused. The only real difference this will make is you don't need to use the widget navigation interface that we've set up if you don't pause the game, because you can use standard listen for input actions like we use in a lot of our other widgets. When the game is paused, we can't do that, but we can make it work with the widget navigation interface. We'll also have to unpause the game when we exit the menu, but other than that, it should be exactly the same. So the next thing we want to do is actually set our input mode to game and UI, because before we were controlling the characters, so now we want to be able to switch and control the menu as well. We do a very, very similar thing for the versus pause menu, so nothing too new here. What we want to call is set input mode game and UI. So we can modify things in the game and widgets. That's the point of this node. And for the player controller, we can get the owning player. Now, theoretically, for now, this is only going to be the first player or the main player in the game. But if you did want to have two players fight against each other in practice mode, and each of those players could bring up their own menu, then we do want to make sure we make the distinction. So getting the owning player just sets us up either way. Then we don't have to worry about it going forward. So I recommend doing that. For the in widget to focus, we need to determine what widget or what element we're starting on. So I've added 5 basic template practice settings row boxes in here. And I just want to start at the top. So I'm going to grab the first index in my practice settings vertical box. It should be a variable from the previous episode. If it's not, make sure you check that. Go back into the graph. We want to get our practice settings vertical box, and we want to get child at, and we're going to use index 0, basically get the first child. This is the widget that we want to focus, that first button, so I'm going to plug that into in widget to focus. And now you see what we have here. The only one that we might want to change out of these 3 parameters is the hide cursor during capture. It will allow us to keep the mouse cursor visible. It's not super important either way, but if you want mouse control in your game, then I would recommend not hiding it. So I'm going to uncheck that because by default it is checked. Afterward, I'm going to call move selection, but we haven't set up move selection yet, so we need to create that function. So I'm going to go to my functions, make a new function, and I've called it move selection. Now, move selection is a function that has two input parameters. When you create it, it's going to open it up in its own little section here. You can click on that node or click on the function in the function list to be able to edit the parameters. Go down to inputs and press plus or add parameter. And we're adding an integer called direction and boolean called play sound effects. So if I expand this window, you'll see direction is an integer, play sound effects is a boolean. So type the name in and then search for integer, type the name in and search for boolean. So direction is going to determine what direction we're moving, either up or down. We don't need to worry about left and right, although we will use that on the practice settings menu. It's going to be a different system. We don't need to navigate anywhere, we're just going to change the value within that practice settings row. So we only need to worry about up and down. Play sound effects is just if we should play a sound effect for moving to that selection. We use this in a lot of our widgets, so you're probably familiar with this already. But I'll cover that as we get to the end of this function here. Now to actually write this function out, we do need one variable as well, and that is going to be current P1 selection. So we can add a new variable that I've made an integer called current P1 selection that has a value of 0. I'm going to actually rename this while we're here, current selection, because this is not a multiplayer menu. We set it up in the event graph to use the owning player. So in this case, we would actually want current selection, not current P1 selection. That way we can account for either player 1 or player 2. But regardless, we need an integer to keep track of what value we're currently on. Essentially, this is index 0, index 1, index 2, index 3, index 4, so on and so forth. We are going to default current selection to 0, and it is going to add, so integer plus integer if you're in Unreal Engine 4, or just add if you're in Unreal Engine 5, the direction. We want to add current selection and the direction. So a up movement is -1. So say we're on index 1, we move up, we're going to index 0. So -1 is the up movement. If we're on the top element here and we press down, we're going from index 0 to index 1. So down is a +1 movement. So we need to check and see if the current selection plus the direction we're trying to move is greater than the minimum and less than the maximum. So we take the result of the addition and we make sure it's greater than, and we want our minimum value. So we can use index 0, so our minimum value is actually -1. We want to make sure that the result of the addition is also less than the maximum value. So less than, this one is going to be less than the number of elements within the practice settings vertical box. So we can grab that vertical box, get children count, and pass that in. Now we only want to trigger that move selection and actually move the element that the player is on if both of these conditions are true. So we need to bring these into an AND boolean. Then you'll get what we have here. We take the result of the and bring it into a branch. And only if that branch is true, meaning both these conditions are true, are we going to update the current selection. And we're updating it to the result of the current selection plus a direction. Node comes out here. We're setting current selection equal to that result. And you can do this by just set current selection and dragging this result in. Now, after we've done that, our movement is essentially done. We just need to actually show the player what it should look like. And we're going to do that by using Determin selection. So Determin selection is another function that we need to create, and we can do so now. So let's make a new function. I've called it Determin selection. Determin selection doesn't have any parameters in it, just a function. And we are going to grab our practice settings vertical box and get all the children, because we need to loop through them to determine if the child that we're looping through is the one that the player is currently on or selecting. If they're not, we want to show the unhovered or unselected style. If they are, then we want to show the selected or hovered style. So practice settings vertical box, get all children, drag the return value, the array, into a for each loop so we can loop through all the children. The practice settings vertical box should only have practice setting rows in it, this individual widget right here. And we have 5 of them right now, just temporary, so that we can test our behavior. So we're going to drag off the array element and cast to that type, which is practice settings row. And this is what we're going to use to change the style. So to know what style we're going to go to, we have to look and see if this is that hovered selection, right? So the first index of the array here, or the first array element, is this top element. When we come into the menu, that's the one that we start on. So this one should display as that light gray color instead of the light blue color to show to the player that's the option they're on. So if we see current selection is not equal to this element, we don't want to show it as that light gray color. We want to show it as the default light blue color. So current selection, not equal, or exclamation mark equal, the array index. Bring this into a branch. If this is true, it means they're not equal. And what that means is we want to show that light blue color for our practice settings row. So here's the cast I mentioned earlier, array element cast to our practice settings row. Now we need to know what we want to change, and so if we go to our practice settings row, I'm changing this entire background part. I called it settings border on the practice settings row widget. So this is the element I want to grab. Make sure that it is a variable so we can actually access it from this other widget. So I'll go back to practice settings, and I'll drag off and look for settings border. I want to get it. And then we want to set the brush of it. So simply you can drag off and type set brush. And I can right click to split the struct pin of the inbrush and just change the individual image of it. You could also use set style like we do through a lot of our other widgets. For the inbrush image, you can go and select the name of the image you want to use. So mine are actually command lists images. That's what I made that image for. So command list border and then command list border selected. So if I go here, the command list border, the default is that light blue color. If I go to the command list border selected, it is that light gray color. So just select the image you want. In this case, I want my command list border default. If the current selection not equal to the array index is false, that means that these two are equal. The current selection is equal to the array index, which means it is the option that the player is hovering over. So when we cast through our practice settings row, we can grab our settings border, set the brush, but this time we're going to set the inbrush image to be the command list border selected, or the light gray one. Now that we have determine selection ready to go, let's go back to move selection and let's call determine selection in here. Don't forget to call it after we set it up. Now we just have to worry about our sound effect. So we have play sound effects, I have reroute nodes. Basically this pin goes into a branch over here, branch, and only if it's true do we want to play a sound effect. In this case I'm using custom play sound 2D, which is a function we created throughout the series. If you're not using this series and you're just using your own method, then you can just use regular play sound 2D. This custom play sound 2D just works with the volumes we've set up throughout the series and a few other things. And specifically for me, I'm using my back out sound. So there we go. That is move selection. Now let's go back to the event graph and we want to call move selection in event construct. Drag move selection in here, and I'm going to leave the direction as 0 because I don't actually want to move it. I'm just going to display the correct option when we come into the screen. Alternatively, you can just call determine selection at the end here. It'll do the same thing. That's up to you. Just make sure you call one of them. That way we actually change the style of the practice settings row that we want, and the top element displays as selected by the player. Next, we have to set up our navigation, so moving up and down, and to do this, we are going to need to implement our interface that we set up, our widget navigation interface in the series. Now, I set this up quite a bit ago, and there's episodes on this behavior in the pause menu, because we needed it to navigate that menu while paused. So I'm going to go to my class settings on this widget and scroll down to the section that says interfaces, and there will be this implemented interfaces section. It should be empty. When you come in here, you can add an interface. So I'm going to click add, and I want to find my widget navigation interface. I've already added it, so it's removed from the list, but you can see it's right here because I have added it. So just find yours and select it, and it will add it. That will allow us to grab the event move up, move down, and a few other functions that we want. So now if we look for event move up, you're going to find it without having to create it, and it's going to say from widget navigation interface. Also find event move down. You'll get this node here. And in here we want to call move selection. So I'm going to call one for move up, one for move down. Move up is going to be a direction of -1, as we discussed earlier. And we do want to play the sound effects because that is a manual movement by the player. Move down is going to be a direction of 1, as we discussed earlier. And we are going to play the sound effects. That is another manual movement by the player. So now we have everything to navigate our practice settings widget. Because the game is being set into a pause state, though, we do need to update our base character BP. So let's go into our base character blueprint here. This is the parent blueprint class. Going into the event graph, we have some behavior that I'm actually planning on changing, because this is going to get ugly really quickly, and honestly there's a much easier way that we can handle this. However, previously in the series, to navigate our versus pause menu and our command list, the two menus that pop up while the game is paused, we were getting that individual widget, checking to make sure that it existed, and if it did, calling move down and move up respectively based on players' input. While it's fine for the character to handle things like menu down P1 and menu up P1, the character really doesn't need to be doing this at all. The whole point is that the widget can handle it, and we actually have that behavior set up, but we never moved it over. It's kind of outside the scope of this episode. I would like to do a general cleanup of this behavior and put it all for the player controller to handle. But that's going to require an episode of its own. So for now, let's just make sure we have this behavior working. That way when we transfer it to the player controller, it will all work as well. So we have input action menu down P1 and input action menu up P1. We basically just want to mimic the behavior of the versus pause menu when pressing menu down P1, so I've added it up here above. So I'm adding get all widgets of class. And for the widget class, I'm selecting practice settings now. And I'm getting the first index because we only need one. There should only be one anyway, but we haven't stopped that from happening in the series, so you could create multiple by pressing the same button. But before we do that, we want to make sure it's a valid index, otherwise we will get errors if we try and use index 0 of something that doesn't exist. So is valid index, bring this into a branch. And only if it's valid, so only if this returns true, do we want to use index 0 here. And then we're going to call move down on this widget. You have a few different ones here. You can call the move down function specifically. We don't want to do that. We want to go through the widget navigation interface. Could just do move down here, which would work. I like to do move down message. As this note says, this does nothing if the target does not implement the required interface. This will be really useful for when we clean this up because we can call this on all of our widgets. And if the widgets don't handle this behavior, then we can simply ignore it without giving an error. So move down message. Only if it's true, we go into that, and then I just routed this into the logic below. So after the practice settings, it goes and checks for the versus pause menu. Again, we're going to be improving this. It's outside the scope of this episode. We'll do it in the next episode for a general cleanup episode. And we want to make sure we do this for menu up P1 as well. So get all widgets of class, practice settings as our class, check if it's a valid index. If it is, get index 0 from that found widgets array, call move up using the message. So move up message. And then go into the other logic that we already had here. But there you go, guys. Now you will be able to open up your practice settings and navigate through it in your fire game series. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do. I just really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership, Discord supporters, and Patreon supporters. You guys are amazing, and I'm so grateful for all your love and support. Very happy to see what you're interested in checking out next. If you ran into any issues while following this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I'd be happy to help you, and that support is free. So that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.